from now, Donald Trump may be back as the President of the United States, and many fear that that will have some dire consequences for American democracy, foreign policy, geopolitics. How is your government preparing to work with him now that you have worked with him in the past, but how are you preparing for that possibility?
What would be the consequences in Canada-United States relations if Donald Trump regains the U.S. presidency?
Actually, that's a great question. I don't think enough thinking has gone on in Ottawa about this potential outcome. And I think the current government has been remarkably irresponsible in approaching this question. The Washington Post, which is the #1 newspaper in Washington that is read every day by decision makers in the United States Capitol, had headlines in the last year that said that Trudeau has told his NATO counterparts that Canada will never meet its 2% NATO commitment, that Canada will never spend its commitment, that will not live up to its commitment to spend on our collective defense and security. That is highly irresponsible in the context of that question, because it's clear that President Trump, in his last term, made a demand of all NATO countries that were below the 2% spending commitment, that they all needed to come up to that level in order to uphold the alliance's collective defense needs. Since Donald Trump made that pronouncement as president, we've seen in the last year many fellow NATO members who were way below the 2% defense spending levels increase their defense spending in order to meet the target. I think about countries like Denmark, which just last year canceled one of their national holidays. It publicly told Danes that that national holiday was being canceled in part to pay for increases in defense spending to meet the 2% commitment. I think of countries like Germany that just under 2 years ago, in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, amended their constitution for the first time since the Second World War ended in 1945 to allow for Germany to increase its defense spending and to uphold its commitment to the NATO alliance. I think of other countries like the Netherlands that has increased its defense spending. I think of Sweden and Finland that have joined NATO and that are going to exceed their defense spending commitments. I think of countries like the United Kingdom and France, which are on track to exceeding their commitments. In that context, for a prime minister then to say to our closest allies and partners, we're never going to meet the commitment, in the context of a potential Trump presidency, I think is highly irresponsible, especially because what we're going to see in a couple short years is the automatic review of the new North American Free Trade Agreement. And if that is done under a new Trump administration, you can bet that they're going to tie the two issues together. And the current Prime Minister has essentially put a bullseye on Canada by making these kinds of offhand remarks that were later published in the front page of the Washington Post. So again, time for a change of government. I don't think this government has the capacity to
extremely difficult problems during the Trump years, where a threat to rip up NAFTA, a desire to move backwards on climate change was a menace not just to Canada but to the world.
Dangerous place for democracies. We've seen the rise of authoritarian states and challenges to democracies around the world. The Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. The Iranian regime is funding and backing rising instability in the Middle East. In fact, just in the last month or so, I think there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of attacks coming from Iranian-backed militants in the Middle East that have attacked other countries and other air bases and army bases throughout the region. The People's Republic of China is increasingly funding and promulgating tensions in the Indo-Pacific region directed at countries like India, Taiwan, the Philippines, and others. And they've detained, as we know, wrongfully detained for almost 3 years, Canadians Michael Chong and Michael Spavor. We have seen so many events around the world in the last couple of years that have shaken the core of the Second World War consensus that benefited Canada and Canadians for so long and that existed for the better part of 80 years since the end of the Second World War in 1945. And the rise of this authoritarianism has not only threatened us abroad, it also threatens us here at home. We've seen increasing evidence of this with the Islamic Republic of Iran intimidating and coercing Canadians here at home on Canadian soil. We've heard recently the Prime Minister allege that Canadian Hardeep Singh Nijjar was killed on Canadian soil at the hands of foreign agents. But probably the biggest threat that we have faced here at home on our own soil has come from the People's Republic of China and its activities here on Canadian soil. So I'd like to take a little bit of time this evening to talk about how the PRC targeted me, not to talk so much about my experience itself, but to demonstrate how that is reflective of the targeting of thousands of Canadians across our country, from coast to coast to coast, but whose stories have gone untold and who suffered in silence despite this targeting. Like millions of Canadians, my parents were immigrants to this country. My father immigrated here in 1952 from Hong Kong, and my mother came here in the 1960s from the Netherlands. They met in Kingston, they got married, and I'm one of their 4 kids, product of that union. But my story is the story of literally of millions of Canadians, tens of millions of Canadians who have immigrated here in recent decades and who have family living abroad as we speak. And the ties that bind these Canadians to their places of ancestry often are broad and deep. I think about my family's experience. And not only was my mother and her family liberated by Canadian soldiers on May 5th, 1945, my father was defended by Canadian soldiers in the early days of the Second World War. The ties between Hong Kong and Canada are long-standing and deep. During the Second World War, some 2,000 Canadian soldiers of the Royal Rifles of Canada, then based in Quebec City, and the Winnipeg Grenadiers defended Hong Kongers against a pretty vicious attack in December of 1941. In fact, the attack on Hong Kong was Canada's Pearl Harbor. Most Canadians know about the attack on Pearl Harbor, but we have forgotten about the attack on Hong Kong. They were actually the same attack. The Japanese decided to attack both Hong Kong and Pearl Harbor simultaneously. The reason why we often forget about it is that because Hawaii is on one side of the international date line and Hong Kong is on the other, but the attacks took place simultaneously on that dark day in December 1941. And so the ties that bind us are long and deep. In fact, today there are some 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong. Fast forward to present day. President Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China became president just over a decade ago. And about 5 years into his first time in office, it became increasingly clear that he was going to be a different kind of president. An increasing number of international norms, laws, and treaties were being violated. This included violations of the Sino-British Joint Declaration that governed Hong Kong from 1997 that was supposed to guarantee the liberties of the people of Hong Kong for 50 years from 1997. The PRC's detention of Western journalists and its increased belligerence in the South China Sea. At the time, I voiced my criticism, as many elected officials did, of Beijing, which usually resulted in the embassy in Ottawa contacting me for a meeting to discuss how they disagreed with me, which is all appropriate and above board. This is normal diplomatic workings, normal diplomatic relations. After my appointment by then Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole as the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, my criticisms of the government of the People's Republic of China increased, matching the increasing violations of the rules-based international order and the repression of people both within the PRC and abroad. including, as I mentioned earlier, the wrongful detentions of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the increasing evidence of a genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority in Western China, threats to national security, and the theft of intellectual property. Barbara and I were talking earlier about the demise of Nortel, and there's evidence that some of that intellectual property was stolen and used to further the advance of telecom companies in the People's Republic of China. These criticisms that I leveled at Beijing in response to these violations also meant that I was speaking on behalf of not just myself, as I had been previously, but also on behalf of the Conservative Party of Canada. On November 18th, 2020, the House of Commons adopted a motion I introduced, which called for the Canadian government to make a decision on Huawei, on its involvement in Canada's advanced telecommunications networks within 30 days, and to develop a robust plan, as Australia had done, to combat China's growing foreign influence, operations, and threat activities here on Canadian soil that were intimidating Canadians. On February 22nd of the following year, a couple of months later, the House of Commons adopted another motion I introduced, which recognized that the PRC's actions toward the 12 million Uyghur Muslims in Western China constituted a genocide. Both of those motions received support from every members of Parliament from every party in the House of Commons. And in response to the second motion on the recognition of the Uyghur genocide, and in coordination with the United States and the United Kingdom, the Canadian government imposed sanctions in response to these human rights violations in Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs live, on March 22nd of 2021. 2022, I should say. 2021, sorry. Just want to get my years straight. It was a long pandemic. In response to the two motions I introduced in the House of Commons, and in response to the other work that I've been doing in the House of Commons, the government in Beijing sanctioned me, along with a number of other individuals in the United States, on March 22nd of that year. As a result, I and others concluded that the sanctioning of me and others was evidence that we were being effective in speaking up in defense of minorities that were being persecuted, in defense of the rules-based international order, in defense of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, abroad and at home. In May of this year, I learned through a report in the newspaper, the Globe and Mail, that a PRC diplomat, May of last year, I should say, that a PRC diplomat working out of the consulate in Toronto had, since 2020, been targeting me by gathering more information about me clandestinely in order to pass that information along to the Ministry of State Security in Beijing to further target me and my extended family in Hong Kong. In response to the public release of this information, the Canadian government declared the diplomat, Mr. Wei Zhou, persona non grata on May 8th of last year. And despite these actions, and despite this public debate in Canada on these foreign interference activities, Beijing continued to target me. In fact, on August 9th of last year, the Department of Foreign Affairs informed me, and publicly released through a news release, that I was being targeted through a disinformation campaign on the Chinese social media platform WeChat, with large volumes of false and misleading information about me, on my background, political stances, and my family's heritage. And the department concluded that Beijing's role in this disinformation campaign on Canadian social media was highly probable. But I tell you all of this, the threats, the interference, the clandestine activity, to demonstrate that it's not just happening to me. It's happening to thousands of our fellow citizens across the land who suffer in silence because their stories have gone untold. And that's the purpose for which I am telling you my story tonight. Because my experience is only but one experience of Beijing's foreign interference threat activities here in Canada. Many cases go unreported and unnoticed, and the victims suffer in silence. Our National Security Service, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, continues to observe that Beijing's foreign interference threat activities in Canada pose one of the greatest strategic threats to Canada's national security. The CSIS has stated that Beijing's foreign interference in Canada is and I'm going to quote here, is a significant threat to the integrity of our political system and democratic institutions, social cohesion, economy, and long-term prosperity, and fundamental rights and freedoms. CSIS assesses that Canada continues to be a target of the PRC, which is seeking to advance their political, economic, and security interests to the detriment of Canada's, and that this threat is a growing concern. This has all direct implications for our fellow Canadian citizens. Some 1.7 million now are of Chinese descent living in Canada, just under 5% of our population. Beijing's foreign interference threat activities target a variety of diaspora groups in Canada using various tactics. For example, in Canada, like the United States, Beijing has established illegal police service centers in Canada, most notably in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. The PRC benignly describes these service centers as service stations, simply there to help Chinese nationals obtain renewals of driver's license and other government documents. But they serve a much more sinister purpose. Human rights groups like Safeguard Defenders has documented that Chinese nationals living abroad or dual nationals living abroad have been coerced through these informal police service centers into going back to the People's Republic of China for more intensive interrogation, particularly if those individuals have spoken up in defense of democracy and freedom. In fact, just in the United States, a couple of months ago, a U.S. indictment unsealed in a federal court in Brooklyn, New York, in October of last year, revealed that an individual in Canada had been coerced back to the PRC. For those of you who don't know, I use the term PRC as a short form for the People's Republic of China to distinguish it from places like Taiwan. Beijing's agents are also threatening people who peacefully protest here in Canada. For example, in 2019, in August of that year, there was a peaceful rally organized in Vancouver to back Hong Kong's protests, to back support for the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1997, which guaranteed Hong Kongers liberties for 50 years from that year. The individuals who peacefully took part in that protest were threatened through social media and in person by pro-Beijing counter-protesters. They were organized allegedly through the support of the consulate in Vancouver. There have also been suggestions that Beijing paid protesters in Vancouver to support the daughter of Huawei founder Reng Zhengfi, who is Meng Wanzhou, at her extradition hearing that took place in Vancouver. In fact, the CBC reported that actors were hired by third parties to protest in favor of Ms. Meng Wanzhou, at her extradition hearing, and only found out later that they had been duped into supporting this in a fake protest in support of Beijing's policies, and many of them later felt it necessary to speak up publicly about how they had been deceived into coming out to that protest and being deceived into getting paid for it. Recently, just in the last several months, Beijing has utilized a new foreign interference tactic by creating wanted lists and offering bounties for the arrests of those living overseas, including some Canadians. Last year, the government of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region placed Victor O, who is a Canadian living in Vancouver, on a wanted list simply for speaking up in Canada about Hong Kong's new national security law, simply for saying that he believed in freedom and democracy and that he was opposed to the crackdown on those rights in Hong Kong. In the last several months, the government of Hong Kong has offered the equivalent of $128,000 US in bounties for the arrest of 8 democracy activists, all based overseas, including some living here in Canada, others living in the United States, Britain, and Australia. Out of the 8 that have a bounty on their head now, 2 have ties to Canada, Dennis Kwok and Elmer Yun, one of whom was born in Edmonton, and the other, I believe, was based out of somewhere in Western Canada. Another tactic that Beijing has used is on our university campuses right here in Ontario. We've heard from Canadians like Kemi Lau, who was targeted by Beijing when she spoke up in favor of Tibetan human rights. Let me tell you what happened to her. She was a student at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. She ran for student council. She won the election fairly and squarely. She then became president of the University of Toronto Scarborough campus student club. In that role, she, like many student activists, started speaking up in favor of human rights. And so she spoke up in favor of human rights in Tibet. In response, the PRC consulate in Toronto organized a whole campaign of threats and intimidation against her, including assault, sexual assault and harassment, and death threats. Thankfully, none of them was carried out, but to be a student subject to that kind of harassment through the direction of the consulate on St. George Street in Toronto is unacceptable. Here's another example at McMaster University. There was a woman there by the name of Ricky Turdish who simply gave a speech at McMaster University talking about the plight of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Western China. Ms. Turdish is the director of research at the Uyghur Research Institute. In response to that speech she gave at McMaster University, the McMaster University Chinese Student Association reported the event and her speech to the PRC consulate in Toronto and published a statement condemning her presentation, and the embassy and the Chinese embassy in Ottawa later publicly praised the students at McMaster University who had singled her out for harassment and threats, and thanked them for their patriotism toward Beijing. As a result, the Chinese Student Association at McMaster University was deregistered, all because of the threats directed towards Ricky Turdish simply for giving a speech. While all of the activities that have been directed to me in some of the cases I've illustrated in my discussion with you here tonight don't involve elections or proceedings in our parliament, the PRC is also interfering in our elections and in our democratic institutions. For example, there were reports in the media in the last several months that international students at Toronto-based universities were being coerced by the consulate in Toronto into voting in party nominations. On February 24th, Global News reported that before Canada's 2019 federal election, a candidate for nomination was assisted by the consulate in Toronto in seeking the nomination in one of the Toronto ridings. Global News reported that the consulate assisted in busing Chinese international students who are not Canadian citizens and not permanent residents of Canada and therefore not eligible to vote in a party nomination race. But the consulate assisted in busing Chinese international students to the nomination and instructed that group to vote for the consulate's preferred candidate. They had the name of the preferred candidate concealed in writing under their sleeves, and they used fake addresses and were coerced them with the threat of having their student visas and scholarships revoked by Beijing. Other tactics of interference in our democratic institutions and elections include the PRC spreading vast amounts of disinformation during election campaigns. And this comes right from the government of Canada. This is not speculation on part of non-governmental actors. For example, in the 2021 election campaign, in the last election campaign, my colleague, Kenny Chu, who was a Conservative MP of Chinese descent from Steveston, Richmond East, was running in that election as a Conservative candidate in Steveston's Richmond East, which is a riding in the lower mainland of British Columbia. Kenny Chu is subject to vast amounts of disinformation coming from Beijing. In fact, within the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ottawa, there is a unit called the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism. It was a unit stood up under a G7 agreement to track disinformation spread by authoritarian states. That unit tracked disinformation spread on Chinese language social media platforms in Canada spreading a hostile narrative about Kenny Chiu and the Conservative Party's election platform, saying inaccurately that if a Conservative government was to be formed after the next election, all individuals or groups with ties to China would be required to register with the Canadian government and potentially be detained in detention camps. None of this information was made public during the election campaign, despite the government monitoring this active campaign on part of Beijing to spread disinformation in Chinese diaspora communities in Canada. The government did not release this information during the 2021 election campaign. This information only came out months after that campaign ended. As a result, in the last year or so, we as members of Parliament, on standing committees of the House of Commons, in the House of Commons itself, have tried to hold the government accountable on national security and on the ever-increasing threat of foreign interference. But we have been unable to get the answers sought to questions about Beijing's foreign interference. In addition to the government witnesses that testify at committee that are often not forthcoming with answers to questions, the government documents we get are often so heavily redacted and whited out, if I can use that term, that they provide little to no information. And so, as a result, over the last 4 years, despite all our efforts, we have gotten very little information, and it's been hugely frustrating to watch the decline of the government's respect for Parliament in the last several years. The House of Commons and its committees have had 70 meetings on foreign interference in Canada. We heard from 364 witnesses and received 152 hours of testimony. The testimony consisted of 1,902 pages of evidence that resulted in 5 reports with 31 specific recommendations related to foreign interference. But still, despite all of that work and effort, we were unable to get to the bottom of what happened in the 2019 and 2021 elections, what happened in between those elections relating to party nominations and the like. And that's why, at our wits' end, last year we called, along with the other opposition parties, for an independent public inquiry, which the government reluctantly and belatedly agreed to. That public inquiry is now established and is now starting its work under Justice Hope. Let me finish by saying this. Foreign interference is a new type of threat we are facing here on our own soil. It's not unique to Canada. Other democracies are facing a similar threat from authoritarian states, and there is no one magic silver bullet to solve the problem. Responding to foreign interference activities of authoritarian states requires a suite of new measures in order to combat these threats. For example, we need to be a lot more open and transparent about how we communicate intelligence to the public. Best practices in other democracies is not to hide intelligence behind secrets and behind closed doors, but rather to let some intelligence go public in a controlled manner so that the public can arm themselves about the threat activities that are taking place and can make informed decisions during elections and in between elections about the threats that they face. Another tool that should be implemented is a foreign influence registry. The United States has long had a foreign agent registry since the 1930s. Australia adopted one more recently in 2019. And just about 6 months ago, the United Kingdom adopted one in 2023. Canada needs to do the same, to give law enforcement another tool to combat agents operating on our soil that are threatening Canadians to go back to China or to do other things that they are not willing to do. They're threatening Canadians into silence to speak up in favor of human rights and freedoms. Another tool that we need to combat foreign interference is we need better tools to combat white-collar crime and corruption in Canada, because often the agents who act on behalf of Beijing here on Canadian soil are doing so because they receive some kind of financial consideration in return. And so we have a problem in Canada with white-collar crime that is now intersecting with foreign interference threat activities. And we need to trace and track where money laundering is taking place, where the proceeds of crime and other illegal financing is taking place, so that we can ensure that those funds are not being used to fund threat activities here in Canada. And that means the establishment of beneficial ownership registries that are now starting to be enacted in law at the federal and provincial level. Parliament just recently passed a new law requiring all federal corporations and all federal trusts to be registered as to their beneficial owners. The province of Ontario and provinces across the country are implementing similar registries to require things like provincially incorporated entities, provincially incorporated trusts, as well as all real estate, to be listed in terms of their beneficial owners, to ensure that autocrats in states like the People's Republic of China can't funnel money into Canadian real estate, into Canadian companies, and use those funds in turn to coerce individuals here in Canada. Finally, we have to figure out how to deal with the new, relatively new technology of social media and disinformation. And there's much debate going on as we speak about what to do about the vast amounts of information we now consume, some of it accurate, some of it not. And again, it's something that we need to think through and have a way to combat, because in authoritarian states, their solution is simple: control all information. We have to balance the difficulty in ensuring that disinformation, like the disinformation campaign last May targeting me, is countered, but at the same time that we don't unduly restrict our cherished rights and freedoms, such as the fundamental right to free expression and the right to association. So I'll finish by saying this. Ultimately, to combat foreign interference threat activities here on Canadian soil requires a new government. It's clear to me that the current government in power in Ottawa doesn't treat seriously the advice they're receiving from our intelligence community, the advice they're receiving from allies, and they are not treating seriously the threats for our fundamental freedoms, our democratic institutions, and the rule of law. Thank you very much.